Hello, hello. It is Tuesday, January 22nd, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we're going to be doing here in History 121 for tomorrow, for Wednesday. And then I'll sort of set up what you'll be looking forward to for the rest of the week. But this will be my last YouTube presentation until Friday, where I'll talk some about your final project that will be going on next over the first couple of days of next week. So the reason I wanted to talk today about the stuff for tomorrow is largely because there is some different media that has been posted different from what was originally in the syllabus. And so I just wanted to kind of clarify what it is that you are looking at and some suggestions for what you should be looking for as you're looking at that stuff. And then also to sort of set up the forum post, because again, this is one of those subjects that is really important, particularly in a big survey course, as we're sort of looking over the broad sweep of American history. I think it's really important to consider the Vietnam War, and the Going to the Source book, again, didn't have a chapter on the Vietnam War. So what I've done is I've tried to put some resources together that I think will go nicely together and will allow you to do some interesting work with that. So let me cut to the chase and just say, what are the media sources that you're going to be looking at? The readings from the textbook will be straightforward. You can just look in the syllabus, and you can get the pages for the readings from the textbook. The online sources, there are two different sources, and they're kind of going in different directions. So I just kind of want to explain what those are and what they're about. The first is a link to an episode of a documentary series, and there are many documentaries on the Vietnam War. The two that are probably the best are the one that you've got an episode for called Vietnam: A Television History, and then Ken Burns had a recent one that's quite good. But if you put all this together, I mean, there's hours and hours and hours of material on the Vietnam War. So I decided to focus in on an episode that was accessible, available, and not too long. And it was from this older documentary series called Vietnam: A Television History. And it focuses specifically on the pivotal year of 1968. 1968 is a key year in American history generally, and in the history of the Vietnam War in particular. As you will see in the documentary, much of what happens in 1968 hinges on an offensive of the Viet Cong into South Vietnam known as the Tet Offensive, named after the Lunar New Year, the Chinese Lunar New Year. And it was a surprise attack. And what you'll see is the consensus opinion of this is that from a military perspective, the offensive was not ultimately very successful, but from a political perspective, it was hugely successful, because it's really in 1968 that opposition to the Vietnam War in the United States really starts to crystallize and congeal. The anti-war movement was relatively small even after 1968. American public opinion is deeply split on the Vietnam War. But the first time you start to see really concentrated, massive dissent against the Vietnam War begins in 1968. It's also just worth keeping in mind just how traumatic 1968 is as a year in American history. This is coming off of a year in 1967 that had seen dozens of race riots break out in cities across the country, including one in Newark, New Jersey, and another in Detroit, Michigan. In Detroit, the National Guard had to be sent in. 43 people died in several days worth of rioting, over $1 billion in property damage. This was the most visible of several race riots that swept through cities in the summer of 1967. Then beginning in 1968, Americans hear about the Tet Offensive. And as the year goes on, both Martin Luther King in April 1968 and Robert F. Kennedy in August of 1968 are assassinated. So it's a very tumultuous and stressful time period. So 1968 is sort of a good year to have in mind as a marker or sort of as a pivot point where perhaps we would say some of the consensus culture of the 1950s and early 1960s starts to erode, and a more confrontational, aggressive counterculture starts to emerge from 1968 onwards. So the video that you have is looking specifically at the events of that year. The other media source that you have is a link to a podcast that deals with what are known as the Pentagon Papers. Now, the Pentagon Papers are not directly involved in the Tet Offensive or anything like that, but the reason that I included it, first of all, it's really interesting. It's worth knowing about if you don't know that much about it, but also because the story of the Pentagon Papers, I think, illustrates how the Vietnam War came to affect American history in a way that went much further than just the war itself. Here's what I mean. So the Pentagon Papers begins as a government study of the Vietnam War, an internal government history of the war. But over the life of these documents, the reason that they're become significant is it goes from an internal report on the Vietnam War to being at the center of probably the most important constitutional crisis over freedom of the press and free speech in modern American history, ultimately ratifying freedom of the press, and ultimately then wind up being sort of the opening wedge in what will later become investigation into the Watergate scandal. The Pentagon Papers and the publication of the Pentagon Papers in major newspapers in time will come to be the first step toward a congressional investigation, which ultimately uncovers ne'er-do-wells breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, and ultimately to the resignation of Richard Nixon. That tells us, I think, a little bit about how the Vietnam War goes from an American combat war in Vietnam to a transformative event in American social, political, and cultural history more broadly. Okay, so that's to keep in mind. So you've got those two media sources, and then the third source that is posted there is the one work of fiction that we're going to be taking a look at this semester. It's a short story by an author named Tim O'Brien called The Things They Carried. Some of you might be familiar with it. I think that some high schools read this story. I don't know if you have or not. If you haven't, it's not very long, and it's fiction, of course, so it's meant to be engaging. It reads pretty quickly. So here's the way that I want you to think about this for the forum post. So imagine that The Things They Carried is basically the primary source that would be at the center of a going to the source chapter. And so what the going to the source chapters always do is they always want to present you with the question, what is this kind of source good for? What can we do with this particular kind of source? And that's what I want you to be thinking of with The Things They Carried. What is fiction good? What do we learn about the Vietnam War from fiction? Now, in order to answer that question, you'll have to do a little bit of research on Tim O'Brien, because you'll need to figure out whether or not this is an author who knows what he's talking about, or whether or not he's just making stuff up. So you do a little bit of Googling about Tim O'Brien and sort of figure out who he is, but then think in particular about comparing the stories that you see in that short story to the depiction that documentary cameras are providing in that Tet 1968 video. That's especially significant because one of the things that you will learn about Tim O'Brien is that Tim O'Brien was in combat in Vietnam in 1968-69. So he was there just about at the time of the events that you're seeing in the film. So does his fiction tell us something that is useful to understand historically? What are the strengths and limits of a fictional representation of this? And as you're thinking about that, keep in mind maybe some of the other sources that we've looked at over the course of the semester that are open to all sorts of interpretation. So for instance, the paintings from the Great Depression, those weren't necessarily objective sources, but a lot of you found interesting things in them. The same thing with the photographs of Native Americans, not necessarily objective or unbiased sources, but still we could learn some things about American Indian history. So what can we learn about the Vietnam War from this work of fiction? Okay, so those are the three sources. The Tet movie, the podcast, which is about an hour long, on the Pentagon Papers, and then a 14-page short story from Tim O'Brien, and that will set up your forum post. Okay, I just want to say just a little bit more about Vietnam, just to create a bit more context for you here. So what you get in the She book is a good narrative overview of American intervention in the war, particularly beginning in the 1960s, and some of the major events that American soldiers experienced. But I don't know that the book does a really good job of explaining why the United States was in Vietnam, how the United States got to Vietnam, and what the whole issue was in the Vietnam War. Maybe some of you have some background in this, but if you don't, I just want to make a couple of important points just so that you have a bigger picture for thinking about the events that you're going to read in She and that you'll see fictionalized by Tim O'Brien. So the first thing that I think, just in terms of having our mindset straight, it's understandable, but it is a little myopic to treat the Vietnam War as a fundamentally American experience. This is fundamentally about Vietnam and Vietnamese people. And the roots of the Vietnam War is not in an American invasion of Vietnam. It's in a civil war in Vietnam amongst Vietnamese people over the fate of what an independent Vietnam will look like. So a little bit of relevant backstory here. Vietnam had been a colony of France throughout the 19th century. It had been known as Indochina, or sometimes French Indochina. Now, at the end of the Second World War, keep in mind, one of the major principles of the Atlantic Charter was self-determination for all of the nations. Well, there had been an independence movement in Vietnam for quite a while, for at least 2 decades prior to World War II. And as World War II starts to erode the old European empires, a lot of these Vietnamese nationalists see it as the proper time to assert their own independence movement. And what they want is independence from France. In fact, many of these leaders, including Ho Chi Minh, who will become the leader of the Viet Cong, really kind of has the expectation that the United States will take their side. The United States being a nation that is anti-colonial and committed to self-determination. In fact, Ho Chi Minh writes a letter to Harry Truman where he quotes the Declaration of Independence and asks for American support for Vietnamese independence. But the United States is in kind of a difficult position because the French have been an ally over World War II. And at the same time, Truman is starting to formulate his Truman Doctrine against communism. And it becomes clear that the Vietnamese nationalists are couching their movement as a socialist or communist nationalist movement. Now, again, it's important to understand, from within the context of Vietnam, communism is seen as a vehicle toward nationalism, toward self-determination. From the United States perspective, Vietnam is part of the domino theory. Vietnam is not seen as Vietnam per se. It's seen as a country that is part of a chain of countries that is going to topple in this line of communist succession. That's not exactly how the Vietnamese themselves see it. They see it as a means of achieving their own independence. Well, concerned about the influence of communism in the Vietnamese nationalist movement, and concerned that the French, although they desperately want to maintain Vietnam, are not able to. They are militarily defeated by the North Vietnamese. The United Nations intervenes in 1954 and essentially splits the country into two. So what we see in Vietnam is essentially kind of a mirror of what we see in Korea, where just as in Korea, there's concern about a communist influenced nationalist movement that the international community becomes involved in, and it basically demarcates what was one country into two countries. That's essentially what happens to Vietnam in 1954 on the cusp of Vietnamese independence. And the reason that the United Nations gets involved and demarcates and splits the country is because what they hope that they can, what the UN hopes it can do under American pressure is to create a non-communist government that could win popular elections and reunify the country that way. So in the late 1950s, there are expected to be a series of elections held throughout Vietnam that will unify the country, but the hope of the UN and the US is that it will be reunified on a non-communist basis. Well, it becomes clear that the government in the South, which is the non-communist government, really has very little popular support. It would lose those elections. The people of Vietnam would choose to support the North. And so those elections are suspended. And in the suspension of those elections, what you essentially have is a South Vietnam that is non-communist and allied with the West, and in particular receiving large amounts of aid from the United States, and a North Vietnam that is communist, but also nationalist. And what we initially see is a civil war breakout between the communist North and the non-communist South. The United States only gradually becomes involved in Vietnam. The United States has had a presence in Vietnam since the 40s, has been strongly backing the South Vietnamese since the 50s, has had various advisors and CIA operatives and all of these types of people going in through the early 60s. But what we tend to think of as the Vietnam War, quote unquote, we tend to think of it as a fairly short thing. Right, Lyndon Johnson dramatically escalates troops in 1965 from like 65 to 68. At the height of it, there's over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. That's when most American casualties happen. That's when most of the incredible amount of napalm and bombs are dropped on North Vietnam. So we tend to think, and it's where the anti-war movement really explodes. So it's from an American perspective, we could see Vietnam as something that is like a mid to late 1960s story. And I just want to emphasize that America's involvement goes back at least 2 decades before that. And the United States continues, of course, to support the South Vietnamese up until it's 1975, when America leaves and essentially loses its first war. So keep that broader picture in mind. And I just want you to understand that, like, there are ways to see the Vietnam War that if we look at it from an American perspective, it's part of containment, it's part of the domino theory, it's part of the Cold War. But if we look at it from the perspective of Southeast Asia, it's a war of national self-determination. It's a war against imperialism. It's a war for a unified country. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing depending on where you're looking at it from. The way that we will mostly be looking at it for today is the experience of the average American soldier who is in Vietnam. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of present a bit bigger picture than the one that you're going to get in Xi, so that you have that to think about and you have some orientation towards the sources. For Thursday and Friday, I think that you're back in the going to the source. I think it will be pretty straightforward what you will be doing, what you will be expected to do. But I will be back on Friday to talk some about your final project, which you might want to start working on over the weekend, and will be finished up early next week. Okay, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.